Hello and welcome to our 10-year anniversary for our HPC Systems open source. And as you are probably used to now, we will have our guest of the day, who happens to be Vijay Raghavan. He has been, of course, the alma mater behind this entire project. He has driven the soul and the underlying spirit behind it. And he has helped get where we are today. So it is a real honor to have him here and to hear a little bit of the history of this initiative since the inception, and of course, a little bit of where we are and where we go. So hello, Vijay, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Great to be here, Flavio.
So Vijay, let's start with the easy part of this. So do you remember the early days? I think it was around, I know that we did the open source project in 2011, but I think it was around 2012 or so when you got fully involved and driving this. So what was your feeling back then? How do you feel we've been doing back then, and what were the core drivers in your mind for this open source initiative?
Yeah, it's interesting because at that time there was a lot of flux, right? There was still, even though we'd made the decision to open source it, and frankly, you made the decision along with some people even before I got involved. There was still some questions hovering in the air. Was this really the right thing to do? Does this even make sense? Is it a distraction? And so I saw my role at that time as, first of all, convincing myself that this was in fact the right thing to do, which took no time whatsoever. In fact, that involved you and me having a Sunday morning meeting. We came to the office at 6 o'clock one morning to go through about 20 items and said, this clearly makes sense. So why isn't everyone else getting it, right? And so then it was largely me beginning a campaign with some of my peers to explain why this makes a lot of sense. I also remember at that time, because Hadoop was in full sway at that point, right? Apache Spark and all those things hadn't yet begun getting any kind of momentum, but Hadoop had gained a lot of momentum. And so in some of the board meetings that I had with the RELX board, they would ask me questions like, well, Hadoop is clearly, it's the name of the game. So are you going to contemplate migrating HPCC to Hadoop as opposed to going down this open source path with
I
HPC?
remember those times.
Right? And my response used to be no, because we'd be taking a giant step backwards if we migrated to Hadoop, because HPCC is far and away. And so it was an interesting set of discussions in that first period of 2012, 2013. But then very soon after that, people began to jump on the bandwagon and began to realize why this makes a ton of sense. We weren't trying to be Hadoop, right? We were trying to be what we already were, which is better than Hadoop. And we weren't trying to be Hadoop in the sense of trying to invite tens of thousands of contributions. All we needed was the 40 or 50 or 100 contributions that mattered, or the 30 or 40 people that really wanted to contribute that mattered. And so getting people to understand that was a huge part of what I was personally trying to get my mind wrapped around at that point in time.
Yeah, I remember those times, and there was some excitement around that, of course, but there is always all of those challenges to answer those questions in a way that is clear to people why we are doing what we are doing and how that makes us successful. So now, looking at it many years down the road, what do you think has been the core benefits of going open source? Today, 2021, almost a decade after that, do you think it was worth it, first of all?
Oh, it absolutely is 100% worth it, because I remember having a conversation with some people who asked me the very question back then. What do you see as the benefits of going open source? And to me, it was a very simple thing, which is we want to make sure that we continue to keep HPCC relevant and delay the obsolescence. Any software gets obsolete, right? But the point is to keep things current. It's no different from people asking about something like Oracle or SQL Server. Is it obsolete? No, because I mean, obviously they're 30-year-old pieces of technology, but they keep getting refreshed, and the engine that's underneath SQL Server or Oracle or any of the modern day platforms that have been around for 2 or 3 decades, it's a totally different engine, right? And so the question really was the benefit, or the answer to the question of what the benefit is that we wanted to keep the engine under the covers of the HPCC refreshed. The HPCC as a name or as a brand, it's the same brand that it was back in 2001 or so when it was invented. But the engine under the hood is totally different. And the benefits going open source was being able to accelerate or delay the obsolescence, how you want to put it, but certainly getting more contributions in order to make sure that engine is kept as fresh as possible over time, based on the new demands coming in from the public, based on the fact there are other constituencies beyond just the internal constituencies who ask, hey, what can I do? What can I do with this? And in fact, we've seen that over the course of the last 10 years, ever since it was open source, there were people who came out of the woodwork in the open source community and said, hey, I'd like to make it do this. And we internally at Risk would never have asked ourselves those kinds of questions. But the fact that they asked us those questions caused us to take another look at what we can make the HPCC do. And we turned that around to our benefit, which is exactly the intent behind the open sourcing. We allowed those other external influences to positively influence us and say, okay, here's what we can make the HPCC do. And by the way, that's going to be good for Risk as well.
Yeah, that is absolutely right. I think some of those pieces of innovation that came in really opened our eyes and made us even contemplate options that we didn't even think about within our LN risk initiatives, right? So that's a great answer. So now, of course, as you just said, HPCC didn't stay static at all, and we had our 8.0 release just a few weeks ago. So there were a few very substantial, dramatic type of changes and new capabilities that we embraced and released in that release, including all of the cloud-related components. So how do you see this shaping up the present and the future?
Yeah, it's interesting because when the HPCC was invented, it was written in such a way that we wanted to get to the hardware as closely as possible.
Correct.
So in fact, 10 years ago, when we started talking about troubleshooting the Roxy or the Thor and things like that, we'd be talking about things like Mellanox drivers, what's wrong with the driver, and we'd be getting down to the nitty gritty of exactly what is the hardware platform that the HPCC was trying to deal with.
We were squeezing the last drip of juice from
Exactly.
every piece of hardware that we had. Yeah.
Exactly. It's literally squeezing blood out of a turnip to make sure the HPCC is functioning as optimally as possible. And the cloud is the exact opposite, right? Where you're supposed to divorce yourself from the underlying mechanics or the specifics of the hardware platform. So just getting the HPCC to, I mean, when you step back and look at that challenge, it's almost as though you're questioning the fundamental essence of the HPCC. But then you take another step backwards and you realize, no, you're not really. It's again a different way of changing the engine under the covers of the HPCC, right? And so where if you take a look at the Thor, for example, how do we think about the Thor conventionally? We think about the Thor as this gigantic, 400-way Thor or whatever it might be, and trying to maximize the use of that 400-way Thor for any one job that goes through it. On the cloud, you don't have that constraint of being limited to a 400-way Thor. You can spin up as many Thors as you want, depending on what you want to do, and you can have as many jobs
or as large of a Thor as you want to. So
right.
You have no constraints.
Right. So really, it's reframing the problem to say the HPCC, whether it's the Roxy or the Thor, still solves problems very elegantly. But the way in which you process the work through the Roxy or the Thor might need to be contemplated differently, right? And so that's exactly what we're in the process of doing. So the 8.0 release and everything beyond the 8.0 release really is about wrapping our minds around how do we process the work through the HPCC in a very different way from how we conventionally limited ourselves to doing, and the HPCC then taking advantage of the cloud infrastructure and cloud APIs and the cloud ecosystem for it to be able to service us in new and different ways that make the HPCC even better than it used to be. That's really how I look at it.
Well, and also the change in the financial model, right? Because when we already have some costs, we bought all of this hardware, we think, well, let's squeeze the last drop of blood from this thing because we want to get every bit of money that we invested. When you go to the cloud, though, the fact that you pay per utilization, per use, per second, per minute of use, changes the equation because now it is important to only have your things running for not as much as not any more than what you need them to run for. So HPCC traditionally had this paradigm that was mostly static. You implemented that cluster, and that cluster was of a given geometry and always running because you had the hardware. Why not? And you could run as much as you could there. In the cloud, changing that model was also quite of a significant mindset change. Going to a place where Thor doesn't exist as Thor all the time. All you have is a queue where you submit your job. And when your job comes in, a Thor comes out of nowhere to run your job and then disappears.
Yeah, but the beauty of what we did in the past, and this is not to be underestimated, is that we ran a very efficient shop, right? Because of the HPCC being what it is, and because of how we deliberately applied constraints. It wasn't constraints in a negative way. In fact, it reminds me of a book that I read called A Beautiful Constraint. Your best work gets done when you put constraints in yourself. Otherwise, if you have all the resources in the world, then you don't get too creative. Your creativity gets constrained. And the HPCC was built at a time and a place when we decided to make the best possible use of a given piece of hardware, right? And to maximize the investment in that hardware. And that's the reason why it took us so long to wrap our minds around going to the cloud, because I was convinced, and you and I have had these discussions many times in the past, where we were convinced that going to the cloud would cause us to take a step backwards financially, in the sense that, yes, the cloud has huge benefits. There's a reason why we're going to the cloud as we speak. But we'd be spending way more money on the cloud because of how efficient the HPCC has been. And so we had to get to the point where we said, okay, you know what? We're still not going to be saving money on the cloud. That's a fool's paradise. We're probably going to be spending a little bit more money on the cloud when we move the HPCC to the cloud. But it's all to the good, because there are other benefits that we gain as a function of moving to the cloud. And the HPCC is still going to be great. And there'll be other things that we'll take advantage of course, in terms of cloud architectures. But the whole point there is moving to the cloud, moving the HPCC to the cloud. If we'd done it 5 years ago, we'd have been spending twice as much money as we did.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. So, Vijay, just to look at a little bit of the future, how do you see this shaping itself throughout the years? So, do you think HPCC will go away? Do you see 9.0 to be yet another dramatic revolution and changes? What do you think is presenting us in the future?
Well, I think that it goes back to the comment that I made about the HPCC being a brand that we conceived of that sits on top of technologies that we invented. And after all, if you rewind back to 20 years, somebody, a bunch of mavericks, which includes you, said, there's got to be a different way. We got to question the sacred cows. We got to build something new. And that's always held us in good stead. So it's not about saying we got to stick to this brand called the HPCC. It's about continuously reinventing ourselves and changing out and swapping out the technologies underneath the HPCC. We could still call it the HPCC and the Roxy and the Thor 5 years from now. Is it going to behave the same way? Probably not. It's going to behave very differently. But that's because we're not wedded to the actual technology. We might like the name HPCC. We might still call it that. There's going to be lots of things that we swap in and out based on what Azure offers us and what we want to take advantage of. That we're not too proud, is my point, right? People like Richard and David and you and everybody who's been involved in the HPCC are intellectually of the right bent of mind to say we're not going to be wedded to one piece of technology just because we've been using it for the last 10 years. We're happy to swap it out when there's a better way to do it. And so that's how I see the HPCC continue to evolve over the next 10 years.
That's a great answer. I think, look, I don't want to make this too long. I think we covered our allotted time now, and this is a great way to close it. What comes in the future really is unknown, but it's going to be more of the same type of excitement throughout the foreseeable future. So, yeah. Vijay, thank you very much. This was really good.
Thank you. It's been a great ride. I'm looking forward to being another enjoyable ride for the next several years. And thank you for everything you've done.
And thank you very much. And happy birthday, HPCC Systems.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
Right.